Thank you, Tamsin and Jerry and everyone. Thanks for everyone for joining us. I'm on the East Coast of the United States, so it's still morning here, but I know it's all kinds of things, all kinds of times, and all these are truly all kinds of times. So I'm just going to dive right in. I'm delighted to be here in conversation with Naila Faruqi and Becky Moyo. For those of you who, some of you have been here for the whole series, some of you are joining for the first time. This conversation is preceded by two conversations, one about aid and one about trade. Both are obviously systems in some significant form of transition,
I'm in a meeting. He
uh,
can't.
to say the very least. Both are being dictated from this end, at least, by an autocrat and his tech buddies. And so, in fact, the way I think about where we are uh, is not as some sort of passive voice phenomenon, but as systems that are being actively destroyed. There are people who are undertaking the active decimation of institutions built over the last 80 years or so, in some cases, many more years than that. And there's real harm happening. People are dying. People are being killed. People are being starved of food and medicine and the basic dignity. Um, and in the midst of that, there are people we've heard from in both the aid and the trade dialogues that have seen real opportunity to, for example, claim control of the aid system in such ways that it might benefit the pursuit of African food sovereignty. And others have talked about there being a political opportunity to imagine a global trade, not just imagine one, but actually implement systems that prioritize the local health, economic development, and not just global wealth. So this session is titled Confronting Contradictions, Philanthropy's Struggle for Redemption in Radical Solidarity. I don't know about you. I read that title several times. I'm not sure what it means, but I do know that I'll be closer to understanding it or understanding many things at the end of the conversation. But really, what we're after here, and for all of you in your daily work, as well as for me in writing and attempting to write a blueprint again, what do these times mean for philanthropy? And what can philanthropy, how could philanthropy perhaps take advantage of some of the uh, hidden opportunities in all this destruction? So we'll have 45 minutes of conversation between Becky, Nyla, and myself, 45 minutes of open conversation. So we're going to jump right in. For those of you who don't know Becky Moyo, he's a Zimbabwean from the Moyo and Ndlovu clans. He's a writer, author, researcher whose interests center around African resources, democracy, and governance. He has helped grow many African civil society associations. He's taken part in the continental processes of development and governance. He is an adjunct professor at Wits Business School, where he heads CAPSI, the African Center in Philanthropy and Social Investment. And he's recorded and published 115 episodes of his incredible podcast, Conversations on African Philanthropy, which I highly recommend. Naila Faruqi has been the director of the Arab Foundations Forum since 2014, and she's grown the organization in 10 countries. The forum includes philanthropies, development organizations, and civil society representatives. Prior to running the forum, she helped localize Sesame Street, working for the Sesame Workshop, a beloved institution around the world, I believe, and one that is very much in the news today as the Corporation for Public Broadcasting has announced it will go out of business due to the Republican Party's retraction of over $1 billion of previously allocated funding. So we in the United States will very soon have a very challenged public broadcasting system. She's also a scholar of philanthropy with several publications and is at work on an advanced degree in philanthropy from Indiana. So it's my great honor to be in conversation with both Becky and Nyla, and thank you both for being here. Let's jump in very quickly, beginning with the title of the session. Nyla, I'm going to come to you first. What do you see as the key contradictions of philanthropy right now?
Hi, Lucy. Thank you. Um, yeah, you're jumping right in.
I'm not going to
Um,
waste any time.
no, no. Um, I mean, I think it's very interesting that, obviously a lot of people are having these conversations right now because we are in this very, very pivotal kind of critical moment. Um, and across so many different factors and facets of our lives. I'm currently in the US. I've been in the US for the last 5.5 months. I used to live in the US for 20 years. um, and it's a very different country. It's a very different landscape. um, and I'm seeing a lot of what you were just kind of describing now really hitting very explicitly so many of the things that I'm involved with. Um, and then obviously there's no way to navigate kind of this ecosystem or navigate the work that we're trying to do without having to consider where do we stand vis-a-vis all of these different things. Um, and so some of the things that have been brought very starkly into focus for me about maybe I guess what you would consider these contradictions, a lot of them today for me, just as a kind of contextual framing of where my maybe perspective is coming from now, is very hyper focused on the genocide in Gaza and what that represents across so many other different things, because I don't think that this is a standalone issue. I don't think that I don't think that you can over focus on it. It is attached to everything else. Um, I think it's a symptom of so many other things, but is also going to be a catalyst for so many things, and particularly in our sector. I really believe that this is an inflection point that may potentially change so many things about the world, but certainly so many things about our work. Um, and so, in that kind of from that framework, some of the things that I've been looking at are this gross disparity between the distribution of wealth versus the accumulation of wealth. um, and really looking at, when we talk about philanthropy, rather, versus charity, versus is it voluntary generosity, is it democratic accountability, do these two things, are they mutually exclusive, is there a way that they can kind of um, work in harmony with each other? I'm not sure that they can.
Mhm.
um, and again, like, if you look at it from the point of view of, philanthropy often operates on voluntary action, not necessarily a democratic mandate, but then it also ends up influencing a lot of public priorities like education, like health, like policy. And so we see that in the examples you just gave, but then also universities and that kind of implosion that sort of happened over the last 2 summers. Um, Looking at what is short-term charity and what is versus kind of structural change and systemic change, and what it takes for that to move in a positive direction if it can. Power shifts versus power hoarding. And then obviously there's no way that we can examine or explore any of this without looking at the the larger global good versus what are neocolonial dynamics that are
Mhm.
perpetuated and continue to be perpetuated. Again, if you're thinking about Palestine, you're going to have to look at you have to look at it through a colonial framework as well. And what does that mean for international philanthropy? And you mentioned something which I think we'll get into a little bit more later on in this conversation, but about also what has that dynamic done for what fundraising looks like today, and what
Yeah.
funding looks like, and what philanthropic action looks like, where it's coming from, where it's being led, who it's being led by,
Yeah.
who's stepping up, who's stepping in, who's failing, egregiously. So there's a lot of different things, and I always, for me, I think also it's been very interesting to think about, okay, what are some of the good intentions that have been coming out of philanthropy, and then versus how is some of that causing unintended harm and some unintended consequences. um Even very well-intentioned philanthropy can sometimes produce these negative consequences, dependency, distortion of local economies. Obviously the undermining of grassroots leadership and grassroots initiatives, and obviously the upending of the entire development sector and USAID and then everyone else that followed is a very good example of that. And the questioning and kind of the exploration of the wielding of soft power and what has that soft power meant? What has it done? What dynamic has it kind of perpetuated for so long? So yeah, I mean, I think, ultimately, even if we're looking at a sector from through a critical lens and trying to identify what some of the contradictions are, it doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't have value, obviously. But it does, I think, suggest, and especially in this moment, which is why I kind of appreciate the opportunity for all of us to have these conversations together, is that it suggests that, if we want to start framing philanthropy from a perspective that is at least working towards true justice, it needs to be interrogated very critically and very openly. It needs to somehow be democratized. It needs to somehow be held accountable, but held accountable in a way that maybe we haven't done before, right? So a lot of people, I think, sometimes worry that that accountability then begets a kind of hostile, butting of heads. But I feel like if the whole thing is burning down, we might as well get as honest as humanly possible and then try to see how we can save the parts of it that are worth saving and change the parts of it that need to be changed.
Yeah, that's really well said. And I think since there are just as with all the contradictions you outlined, there's also an addition. I would also put philanthropy specifically in the bucket of institutions that either are or are about to face a deliberate effort at destruction. And with all the talk of reform over the years, is anyone ready with a picture of what better would look like? Is kind of the question I have. Becky, your thoughts on the key contradictions of philanthropy as you see them?
Yeah, thank you so much, Lucy, and glad to be in conversation with you and Naila. Maybe rather than contradictions, I would probably frame them as complexities. So I'll start with the first that Naila already mentioned, which is that, a lot of times, in good intentions, philanthropy creates dependency, but then it finds it so easy to exit without proper planning, without a lot of warning. And we've seen this with a number of philanthropic institutions that have been giving support in the global majority world, for some of them for more than 40 something years. And then it's so easy to just pull out and change strategies, move regions, and leaving behind a number of institutions that had built a relationship with the philanthropic institution, built an ecosystem, and that pulling out without proper exit strategies creates more damage than perhaps
Mm,
the benefits that would have been
yeah.
achieved over the long run. So at least one of the biggest philanthropies at the moment has given a 20-year notice, talking about the Gates Foundation now, that in 20 years' time they'll be closing down. And so there's at least some time, I think, to engage with the foundation and figure out what type of exit strategies should be done. But this is not the norm. So I just wanted to raise that the issue of dependency and how easy it is for some philanthropies to just change tact and strategies and move on as if nothing has happened. I think the second is, has to probably talk to the current moment. Um, you know, I think we have always known that, the development aid, especially overseas development aid, was reducing and decreasing over time. But the beginning of this year was more dramatic, and that, in a way, forced us to look at the reaction not just of governments but also of philanthropies. And I found that for the majority of American philanthropies, they immediately inclined towards compliance, rather than focusing on what the issues
Mm,
on the ground are. And so a lot of them were really worried about compliance issues. And so you find that, even when you're writing proposals, you have to change a lot of language, so that, you have to deal with the issues of compliance, so that you don't put yourselves and the American foundations on a spotlight, especially given the current moment. So I think compliance rather than addressing the failure of a democratic culture for me is startling because this is the moment to really deal with the failure of the democratic culture. But philanthropies, especially those of the American system, in a way leaned towards compliance, and that in a way raises the issue around philanthropy having some fears at times to confront demagogues or dictatorships, but rather finds it easier to do so through their beneficiaries. It's easy to support beneficiaries to work in conflict zones, to work in highly charged human rights violations, etc., etc. But when it's actually the time for philanthropy to deal with it directly, we see a retreat towards compliance issues, and so I think that's a complexity that we see with philanthropies. The third one I want to raise, and this comes out probably in Rob Rech's publication, Just Giving: Why Philanthropy is Failing Democracy and How It Can Do Better, is that philanthropy does not always create equality. In most cases, if you follow the philanthropies, let's say of high net worth individuals, they at times support what really appeals to their hearts and not what is really necessary for the development of a particular country. So at one time I was invited by the government of Rwanda to help them develop their philanthropy strategy. And immediately what we noticed was that there was a lot of philanthropy going into the country, but it wasn't aligned to the development strategies of the country. It was really what philanthropies themselves wanted to support, and what they wanted to support had absolutely nothing to do with the real need of the country. And so the idea was then to figure a way in which you write a strategy that aligns the philanthropic resources with the country's needs and requirements. And so I think that idea that philanthropy is answerable mainly to itself unless it is regulated, it can end up creating inequality instead of actually addressing inequality. And we know that philanthropy is not always democratic. How are decisions arrived at, etc. How grounded is it in the local context? More often, philanthropies at times are not grounded in the local. So these are some of the contradictions, maybe complexities rather than contradictions, that I think are so obvious and they are so key, and they will be so useful to address if philanthropy is to be transformative and address the challenges of the current context. So let me stop there, and then we can get back to some of the points if need be.
Thanks, Becky. Well, that the two of you have is clearly there's no shortage of contradictions or complexities here. I've got about a dozen from that rapid fire roundup, and I should just say to be clear, I meant, and I assume both of you were referring to in your comments, foundation philanthropy, institutional big philanthropy, and I'm going to just throw one in of my own here that I do think is a contradiction, but it refers to the quote unquote reformers, not the institutions themselves. I think the longer we tell ourselves, in the States at least, that these are institutions interested in justice, the harder the reform effort becomes, because I think foundations are portions of wealthy people's financial portfolios. I think that's what they are. And we can't change something if we're not honest with what they are. And so I'll just throw that into the mix. And it's where I would start. Next question for both of you is, given all of this, and given the fact that at least right now, the largest foundations in the US and many of the smaller ones are running scared. Where would you start if you had a chance to if you took this chance to sort of change what we're talking about when we talk about philanthropy? Where would you start to change that conversation? Nyla, let me come back to you first.
Sure. Um, so again, I think in this moment, a lot of it for me comes back to Gaza and it comes back to this moment. And I know I sound like I'm completely monomaniacal about this, and I kind of am in a way, again, because I don't think that it's a standalone issue, and I don't think that it's divorced from everything else. Um, but one of the things that really, I mean, very, very, in a very concerted way, really been thinking about is so much of this can feel very overwhelming, because there's so many things that are being thrown at us at the same time. And in a way, obviously, it makes sense that that would happen because, again, in situations like this and in instances like this, historically, that's part of the plan, right? Is that you throw everything so that people are not able to galvanize um, enough power to kind of protest and push back. But I think central to all of this, at least for me, is around the narrative, and around the reclamation of narrative, but also kind of shifting that paradigm shift around cultural imagination of when you're thinking about philanthropy, about who has the right to give, who has the capacity to give, who actually has the agency to be able to define value and what value means within different contexts. And then who holds ultimately the power to lead any of that change. And I think for so long, philanthropy has either been shaped by kind of elite Western institutions, a little bit, to what your point is, foundations with these billion-dollar endowments that are, outside of the realm of possibility for almost, 99% of the world, boards that don't necessarily reflect kind of communities that they're supposedly helping to fund and care for. And then these grant making practices that really reinforce hierarchy and position themselves to be synonymous with generosity and solidarity and justice and all of those things. But then, you kind of dig a little bit deeper and realize that these are just buzzwords that aren't being lived by, right? Like, I mean, a very big point of reflection, I think, for me and a lot of my colleagues and peers and comrades in all of this fight over the last 2 years has been about, like, when people are talking about solidarity, in solidarity, the number of emails that I've gotten over the last 2 years of in solidarity. And I appreciate the sentiment 100%, and so many of us do, but then you kind of think, but that's not just a word that you say. It's kind of like, what have you actually done that is in solidarity? And it's difficult, is exactly, Lucy, to the point that you were making about when you start interrogating these things, if you're not willing to call them what they are, your interrogation is, I mean, what's the point, right? um, who cares? And it's been a little bit difficult. This moment has been a little bit difficult because you don't want to, when you're in a position like this, when you're confronting this kind of assault on all of the institutions that you've been led to believe that you're supposed to depend on, in every facet of your life. And when I say we, I'm talking about, like, um, community, society, whatever. And at the same time, you don't want to come across as too combative because you don't want to other everyone else, but you also kind of realize, like, there's no way we're going to have this discussion bring anything to fruition that's positive if we're not willing to say, by the way you're doing this really sucks and it's not going to work for much longer. So I think the narrative is a big one for me. And again, I'm going to look at it from the perspective of, representative of a global majority that hasn't had agency over the narrative and has really had a lot of that narrative shaped for us by others. Um, so that's one thing. And I think, again, one of the things that's been very interesting for me and controversial in a weird way, you mentioned earlier in your introduction of me and Becky, that I'm currently pursuing my master's degree at Indiana University, in philanthropy. And I'm actually doing a second master's. I'm not really sure what I'm thinking, but I'm doing a second one in Muslim humanitarianism through the Zakat Foundation, who have
Hmm.
been so incredibly generous, to offer scholarships to these two. But I don't know what I thought I was doing, accepting to do both of them simultaneously. However, that's a different issue. And one of the things that has been very eye-opening for me when I think about, like, what I would highlight if I had to say what can we tackle first, have been around, mutual aid, for example, and community wealth building. So if we look at some of the contradictions we talked about earlier, the hoarding of wealth and the distribution of wealth, and these aren't necessarily new ideas, right? And they're in some cases ancient. They're very globally rooted. Whether you're looking at, and so in my context, if I'm looking at zakat and waqf, for example, waqf being Islamic endowments, in the Muslim world, communities have forever taken, care of each other without needing elite intermediaries and without needing Western intermediaries. Um, and I've made some, it's in conversation, like, made some advocacy for elevating these models again, or like reinvigorating them as legitimate kind of powerful systems of collective care, and not as alternatives, but as leading, you know,
Yeah.
and in some cases I've been a bit surprised by people sort of being like, oh, no, 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 don't, like, let's not push the boat that,
Mm,
let's not rock the boat that far.
mm,
Maybe don't call it Islamic finance. Maybe don't call it, principles of Islamic giving. Try to give it a
mm,
different name. Again, like this
mm.
unwillingness to just name
Yeah.
things what they are and say, but what's wrong if, if if you're looking at it from a lens of Islamophobia, that's probably your problem, not mine.
Right.
Um, right? So that's kind of one thing. And then again, democratization, democratizing financial infrastructure. I think I had said something at last year's APC about, not having to be beholden to these institutions that don't serve you anymore. And why can't we just openly say we're just not going to engage? We will build our
Yeah.
own. We will, if you build it, they will come. So those are kind of the, if I had to start somewhere, I think that's
Yeah.
where I would start, so that you don't get overwhelmed and then are unable to, you have this like task paralysis because you can't handle
Yeah.
everything at once.
And there's so much in what you've just said about um, the language and reclaiming that narrative, because the more unwilling people are to, in your example, call it Islamic finance or whatever, is ceding that power at the same time that you're just trying to kind of manipulate that power. So it goes very deep. Becky, where would you start?
Yes, I think I will also, echo what Naila just said, especially around narratives, and apply it to the African context. And that's partly why we thought that we should set up CAPSI to reposition the narrative on Africans and African philanthropy, because for a long time there seemed to be some form of a hierarchy in terms of philanthropies of the world. And so we wanted to make sure that the narratives are done in such a way that African philanthropy also shares in the universalization of all forms and expressions of philanthropy. So that's what we are doing with our research, with our teaching, as well as with the convenings that we have been holding. We just came back from the sixth African Philanthropy Conference. And if you look at the themes that we have embarked on, they've all been necessary themes that look at what's happening even today. So I would emphasize the issue of the narratives. But secondly, I would also say I think for me it's important to start at the local level. When we're talking about philanthropy, there are three. I mean, as of the last research, there were three Africans whose wealth was equivalent to half the population of the continent. Three, three wealthy Africans whose wealth is equivalent to half the population of the continent. That means those three individuals, if guided properly, assisted properly, they could solve much of the problems of the continent. So we need to start at the local level to understand the different forms of resources that exist, whether it's in the form of financial wealth, assets, land, minerals, etc. And we need to work with the local philanthropies in all their expressions. So I mentioned the high net worth individuals, the three, but there are several others. But philanthropy also in the continent expresses itself in various other forms. I mean, if you look at, people to people, many to many, whenever there's a disaster, a humanitarian crisis, people organize themselves and they immediately pool their resources together, and they try and address whatever the humanitarian crisis could be at that particular time, and no one really goes hungry when that happens. People find ways of pooling resources in that manner. So there's many to many. That's one framework in which we can look at many to many. Then there's one to many. All of us individually, we are inclined to assist whenever there's a need. It could be supporting somebody to go to school. It could be contributing to pooled resources. But there's also one-to-one. There's many-to-one. So I think that if you look at, for example, how COVID was addressed by philanthropies in all their various expressions, it was mainly the people at the local level who were first to respond and provide, solutions. And so what this means is that we have to rethink the models that we are using. Maybe it's time for big philanthropies to be complementary as opposed to them leading the way.
Yeah.
So they ought to be complementary. And we have seen, you know, we have seen over the last couple of years a huge growth and increase in big philanthropies developing their own strategies. And this has created some chasm or gap between what's needed at a local level and what philanthropies actually think is necessary interventions.
Yeah.
But if you look back in the day, philanthropies and foundations did not really have strategies. They responded to the local context and the local needs. And I think this increase in the strategies by foundations and philanthropies needs to be re-examined to make sure that when they do so, it is complementary with what's happening at the local level, but also to build the capacity of local philanthropies, because philanthropy exists in all forms everywhere. I
Yeah.
think we just need to manage the competition that is there in most of the ways in which philanthropy is practiced. And lastly, I think it's, for me, when I look at where we are now, uh, this is a call for for us to return to associational life, bottom up processes. How do we support social movements, residents associations, etc., because that's where the energy currently lies. That's where the solutions currently lie. And I don't think anything or anyone flying from outside would be able to solve the problems at the local level without building on the associational life that has been created already. And I think for a while, we actually let the bonding and the bridging capital at local level to almost rescind, and we need to rebuild that and see what will happen if we focus on associational life at the local level.
So I want to build on this because I think we're one level away from where we want to get this conversation. Both of you have spoken to, and both of you represent, to the degree you are representative of anything, cultures and communities with long, robust, and existing, thriving um, local collectives of care, to use Nyla's terminology. The West has never hesitated in imposing norms and expectations. Here I'm thinking specifically about what was touted, and I was involved in this, I'll take the blame. The expansion, the building of the TechSoup database on nonprofit equivalents, right? Intended to foster more giving from American, primarily philanthropies around the world. But and here I'm guessing, I'm out of my, wasn't involved in this part of the history, but that those 501c3 equivalents are not necessarily the associations Becky's talking about or the systems of collective care that Nyla's referring to. That there wasn't an effort to really understand what was the pre-existing infrastructure, if you will, and respect it and fund it. There was going to be something else. So perhaps ironically, perhaps just a representation that we live in a very globalized system, helping to revitalize, and that may be the wrong verb, these existing associations, these existing practices, to some degree requires teaching the North and the West to behave differently. What and where and how is that happening? I mean, how does that happen? How do but we're back to trying to change American foundations. Maybe it's closing the doors to them. I mean, Nyla has proposed that, that alternatives, and I meant in this conversation, it might be closing the doors, but what is the best way, or what are the ways to bring that forward in ways that will change the behavior of the foundations. Becky, you just came off of a 5-day conference doing some of this. What are your thoughts on how to do this, and where is it happening? Are there examples we can point people to?
Yeah, I think conversations are underway, and some of them have been taking place as far back as one can remember, either through writings or through different consultations or conferences. So if I think of, how Trust Africa, for example, was born, there was a series of conversations around a special initiative for Africa, and Jerry was part of that. And part of that conversation led to the establishment of Trust Africa, and the name itself is indicative of what
Yeah.
others wanted us to do. You need to trust Africa, trust Africans, trust institutions, and move resources to those institutions. In a way, it was a call for a shift in narrative. It was a call to shift behaviors, etc. So that's one, element where one can, refer people to, and it dates back to the early 2000s, right? And then the establishment of the Africa Grantmakers Network, which is now the Africa Philanthropy Network. Again, a lot of the individuals who were part of that conversation, moved from one region to the other, but always asking themselves, how do we create a platform where we are not spectators, we are not performers in other people's terrains, but we set up a space where we can learn from each other, set the agenda, etc., etc. So the formation of the Africa Philanthropy Network was also another conversation that was confronting some of these behaviors. And then, of course, I think of late we've all been part of some of the conversations around Shift the Power movement, which have also taken a lot of conversations around what power looks like, where it resides, and how it can be, shifted. I have argued not necessarily for shifting the power, but I've argued for restructuring power and sharing power, because I have not believed that you can shift power fully, but rather we could share and restructure it. But that conversation, I think, is probably more than 10 years old now, and there've been lots of, declarations and calls for that to happen. Is it happening? I think not really. So I don't think we are running short of any spaces and conversations for that to happen. I think it would really have to come down to the willingness of the different institutions to actually make those changes. So that's how I look at it, Lucy. I don't think it's really an issue of education. I actually think it's an issue of political will. And when the time is ready for people to make that decision, they will do so. But otherwise, the spaces are available. I mean, we just came out of the APC. That's a platform now where we also have a track where we meet with several development partners to really work with them to understand what their interests are and also how they can support in a way that is transformative some of the institutions and some of the issues that are raised at the continental level.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Becky. Nyla, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I mean, to much of what Becky's saying, I think definitely none of these conversations are new. I think we've just found ourselves kind of in this moment where now there seems to be a little bit more urgency in having them and in having them a bit more honestly and a bit more openly. Which is why I think I appreciate these kinds of conversations, even though they're happening a lot, but it's a good space to continuously, sometimes you have to repeat something enough times for it to start taking. And you know, there's been an interesting, I don't want to say confrontation in a negative way, but an interesting confrontation around what does it mean when we're talking about shifting power? And so I really appreciate what Becky's saying about not necessarily framing it from a complete shift from one thing to another, but then, maybe like a transformation and a sharing of, and the confrontation that I'm referring to is, I'm going to try as much as possible not to give away too much so that I can, be discreet, which is not always my strong suit. But I had a conversation with two very, very, very well established, historically very ever present aid agencies, Western aid agencies. And in both of these conversations, there were two separate conversations. And in both of them, the people I was speaking with, obviously checking in, like, how are you guys doing with all of what's happening? In one case, they've lost 80% of their funding. In another case, they've lost, almost 60% of their funding, had to slash their staff almost, in half, if not by 70%, like really, really devastating consequences. And at one point in both conversations, they said something like, well, we're actually, I mean, we're fighting for our survival, and it's like, it's a fight to the end. And we're thinking of potentially merging with this other,
Yeah.
right? And I think the expectation was that I would say, oh my God, of course, that makes perfect sense. And I literally said, what the hell are you doing? What are you talking about? Merging? So you're just going to you've learned nothing? Like, you've learned nothing from this moment? And then I kind of realized, okay, that's probably not the best way to keep your friends. Um, so I said, can I understand a little bit more about like why that's your go-to rather than, you know, you have this wealth. I mean, in one case, this is an organization that's been around for almost 100 years. You have this wealth of resource. You have billion-dollar endowments. You have these communities that you've supposedly been propping up around the world, and just it brings into question this idea that, like, what would a more or a better information environment look like? What would a better philanthropy environment look like? And it's not easy to tell people, like, you need to decenter yourselves. It's
Yeah.
not just about diversifying it, right? So when you talk about a truly equitable information ecosystem, it's not just about, oh, adding more global south or global majority voices to existing Western platforms, or being an aid agency that has satellite offices around the world because your local team is from Nigeria and is from South Sudan and is from that's not you're not doing anything different. And I understand that people are scared to give up and cede that power, but they've held it for so long. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that you're going to become, like, nobody's saying, oh, you get rid of all the Western institutions, therefore they no longer exist and nothing about their institutional knowledge exists and we're all going to start from scratch. But at the same time, again, like, we want, I think what we're asking for, global majority voices are asking for, is help us elevate in epistemologies that have been around
Yes.
for centuries, right?
Yeah.
When people talk about, oh, the nascency of Arab philanthropy, I'm like, what are you talking about? The first ever recorded act of philanthropy in history was recorded in Morocco in 859 AD. This is not nascency. um and so it becomes, and you don't want to have to do this, like, us versus them thing. But, like, if that's the starting point of the conversation, then yeah, no, we definitely need to change it. So, and recognizing that, knowledge is power, and recognizing that in its current iteration, it is a site of colonization. What does it mean when we say decolonize aid? It doesn't mean, shut everybody down, but it certainly doesn't mean fight for your survival by merging
Yeah.
and, continuing to perpetuate this model that is clearly not going to work moving forward.
Yeah. And when I do want to get to the information environment, and I think globally we are in a moment of epistemological imperialism akin to uh, the worst of whatever has come before with the whole instantiation of AI. It's absolutely about developing an imperial epistemology. So, with that background, I do want to just bring together perhaps what both of you have said, um, and link it to something that was said in a previous one of these conversations by Dr. Leopoldo Pecchi, who noted that in her view, Africa has actually always been the philanthropic giver because it's Africans' history, culture, and knowledge that's been taken or given in this dynamic with Western philanthropy. And what it makes me aware of is the degree to which the Western foundations have generally been able to act around the world as they wanted because they didn't really want anything. Now, the West, or at least the white European progressive West, is talking about things like local food sovereignty and agroecology. And the expertise there is on the African continent and probably throughout the Arab world as well, and in indigenous communities. And now so the West needs something now. And I don't know exactly where that puts us in terms of this power sharing moment, but it seems to me when both agendas are clear, in the past, one side really has had an agenda of imperialism or imposition, and now they want something that's knowledge based, and that might open an opportunity for some real change. Um, but I also, and speaking also to some of the ecosystem comments that have come up in the chat, um, and also there was a mention of catharsis. Catharsis strikes me as a nice word for somebody's going to die here. Some things are going to go out of business. And I think we have to be realistic about that. To your merger comment. I mean, merging just says, oh yeah, what we were doing was exactly right. Now we're going to do it together. So I want to switch a little bit slightly, but still building on what you said, and then I'm going to hand this over to the whole group in a second. I just want to ask Naila about something because I think very recently you and Halima Mohammed said to the West, no, no more, by stepping off of the advisory board of Alliance Magazine and proposing an alternative. And I'd like you to talk about that a little bit, if you would.
Yeah, sure. I mean, first, let me kind of contextualize this a little bit because I think it's really important to understand what got us to that moment was months and months and months of really belabored kind of conversation and um, just a very thoughtful process. And it was very painful. I mean, I don't, I am prone to dramatics, but in this case, I'm not trying to be dramatic, but I really I cried a lot.
Yeah.
And I had to think a lot about why I was taking it so personally. Like, why was I feeling so overwhelmed by having to make this decision? And Halima as well. I don't want to speak for her, but I know that for both of us, I mean, this is hours and hours and hours of conversation that we had over the course of 6 months. Um, and when we finally decided to step away, part of it was that I remember I had said to her, if we're going to do this, I don't want to do a quiet quitting kind of thing because this is so emotional and so important and so critical that if we're going to do it, I want to do it with purpose and intentionality, and then also be very clear about the reasons. Um, and our decision wasn't just a protest against editorial choices, right? I mean, it really was a statement about like very deeply skewed information, the information environment that I was referring to, and how that kind of shaped how philanthropy is understood, how it's funded, how it's reported more than anything. Um, and at one point, I remember saying to Halima, like, we're both women who are not from the global majority, but have been able to kind of occupy spaces that are normally maybe not open for people like us, and maybe in my case more so than not, because I'm very white passing, and I have lived in the US for 20 years, and I'm a US citizen, and I was born here, and all of that stuff. But at the same time, really, I know in my heart that that's not who I am. Those aren't, that's not the space I actually occupy in my day-to-day life. And I remember saying to her at one point, I'm being perfectly openly and candid here and vulnerable. But at one point I said, with all of my big talk and like my big, oh, I'm confident I can do whatever and they can all go screw themselves, white men still intimidate me. And confronting someone like that, even though it's somebody who's younger than me, intimidate me. And I, could probably start crying. If I had to do this in person, I might burst into tears. Um, and I said, and I really need to understand why that is, because in my soul, I know that we have to walk away from this. This is no longer, I can't look at myself anymore if I continue to serve on this advisory board, editorial advisory board. So, and at one point, she finally said, I said, why is that? Why am I having such a conflict? And that's when, Halima said something like, Naila, their framing, their being Western, is peace. coexistence, and why can't we all just get along so that we can continue to perpetuate this beautiful life that we've built for ourselves by colonizing somebody else's land, versus our framing, which comes from this kind of visceral need for justice. And those two things are not always compatible. So that's kind of where I was like, oh, I mean, absolutely, you've hit it. Like, this is it. Let's do it. But then we also, in our discussion, were saying, well, we're going to do this and we're going to call out this lack of, a diverse platform, this lack of agency, this lack of allowing the elevation of these epistemologies that we're talking about. And I don't want to just be bitching and moaning. I would really love it if we could say, well, this is something that we don't think serves, and here's how we would propose something that might be an alternative to that. And the first thing was, oh, well, we don't have any money. And then at one point I just said, you know what? I don't care. I don't care. I'll put my own money. I don't care. I will fund it. I mean, I don't have any money, but whatever I do have, I'm happy to do this. I'm happy to ask people if they'll, volunteer. And it literally, I just said, Halima, we need to stop talking about how could we do this? What would it look like? We just do it. Whatever it is, we just do it. So what would we envision is a open platform. Maybe we'll start with like a quarterly, so that we can't overwork. We all have day jobs. Quarterly publications that we would invite guest editors to curate. We'd have like a roster of readers and editors who would be willing to kind of volunteer their time in the beginning, and we would allow submissions from anywhere in the world talking about a particular thematic arc. People would be invited to submit in their own local language and to not have to put it in perfect English, not have to be academically rigorous, unless what we're doing is a research paper, and then we could also help support with academic rigor. And really, for me, ultimately, the idea was like, at some point, I want us to be able to say, oh, this was published in Palestine, this was published in Egypt, this was published in South Africa, and for people to not question whether it has the backing of a Harvard or Columbia, who anyway, I mean, let's be honest, have already, they've kind of squandered a little bit of their credibility in the last 2 years. So I want there to be that, not better than, but just like it's as good. This is as valid, it's as sound, it's as important, and it contributes as much to, the knowledge building. So that's kind of what look, it's very early days. We have zero money. So, open invitation. I'm going to be completely shameless here. Anybody who'd like to help us fund something like this, just to really like talk the talk and walk the walk and be like, if we're going to do this, we're going to do this right,
Yeah.
as right as you can.
Thank you for sharing that, all of it from the beginning through that. I would welcome the chance for the Blueprint to amplify what you're doing in any way it possibly can. And I hope there are others on this call who will say, yes, count me in. I think it's absolutely critically needed. Thanks for sharing that, Nyla. Let me turn now to the full group. Questions, picking up on, there's a lot in the chat. There's a really interesting framing question I see about time, thinking about the now and the future and trying to work on both time frames at once. I don't know if either of you wants to pick up on that, or if there's anyone in the room who wants to raise their hand and ask a question directly, that would be great. I can't see the whole chat, so I can't manage the whole chat very well. But
So maybe I can also just add, I wonder, Lucy, if Nyla's comment would be useful for you and Becky, just to also talk about the Blueprint and Blueprint Africa and how these ideas are coalescing.
brilliant. Yes, of course, that would be great. So I'll Becky and I, Nyla, to what you've got underway. The Blueprint is this conversation, and others are part of informing a transformation of the Blueprint that I hope will become a global conversation filled with local wisdom. So something very different than what it has been and what it is. Not a solo authored document, but many voices. And we've been in conversation with Becky and at CAPSI about how we might do this with people on the African continent. Becky, would you say some more about that?
Yes, I can, but I think I saw Prof. Fowler, who is actually a good colleague and friend of ours here at CAPSI, the chair on African philanthropy. I think he wanted to say something before he
Oh, did
dashes
I
off
miss you, Alan? Did I
at
miss?
1:30. Yeah, I think he says he
Oh,
wants to dash off at 1:30. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't actually want to say anything. I've put some stuff in the chat. It's just I have to leave, and there's no time. So, and I find that very regrettable, if I may be cautious in my expression. So I have to leave at 7:30 and 5:30. I'm sorry, I just do. So sorry, but
Do you want to
thanks,
pick up
Tasman.
on any of your comments in the meantime, or just quickly in your last minute?
Well, my last minute. It's very kind of you. Um, I suppose my points come from just so many vantage points of having been in so many institutions within this whole game for almost 50 years now, no, 40 years now. And I think what Nyla said is, to some extent, there's nothing new. And I have maybe a somewhat, I don't know, and it's in one of my comments. I've worked with so many organizations that want to do transformative change, and it only happens when there's a catharsis.
yeah.
Is this the catharsis that US philanthropy needs? It's not an answer, it's a question.
Mhm.
And can we make what was that well-known thing? You need to you should always exploit a disaster or something. No, what is it that
Yeah,
there's an expression?
every
What is
crisis has an opportunity.
But this is cathartic. It's not a SOMAR incremental da-da-da-da. Is this the moment to have a serious rethink about what cathartic processes can tell us?
Mhm.
So thanks for that, and thanks for the opportunity, and thanks, Becky, for, well, we know each other, so whatever. Thanks very
Thank
much.
you.
I do actually have to leave.
That's fine. Alan, I'm going to come back to you and we might have a conversation on catharsis. That will be
You are
wonderful.
more than welcome. Okay, bye everybody, and thanks for putting up with me.
Bye, Alan.
Ciao.
Back to
Becky,
you.
is it a cathartic moment? Is there?
Let me speak to how we're thinking of using the blueprint, going forward, especially at this moment. So we've been having conversations with Lucy, Tamsin, and Jerry on how we could apply the template in the African context. And so there are a couple of things that we think this could be done, and some of them are already underway. So the first is, hosting and holding a number of conversations, and these take different expressions. One is high-level public lectures. We find that because we are located at a university, the idea of a public lecture actually draws a number of people. In a space that is easily accessible, a language that most people would understand, but also providing enough, I would say probably independence and thought leadership without really feeling, in a way, limited, because the university provides some form of academic freedom to discuss even some of the most sensitive issues. So, for example, beginning of this year, we actually hosted the Open Society Foundation's president at a time when the majority of foundations thought, that conversation could not be held, and we actually did hold it at the university. So I think public lectures will be something that we hope to, curate some of the conversations around that. And then the second is, conversations, public high-level dialogues, where we have thought about and put together about 5 conversations that we're planning to do. The first is the future of multilateralism, and we actually did have some conversation on this already at the last APC, but we are hoping to hold a bigger meeting alongside the G20 in South Africa, just to think about, what is the role of philanthropy, especially within the context where the future of multilateralism is a bit questioned at the moment. Then the second is on raw and earth minerals. The majority of countries, especially in the southern part of Africa and a bit in West, are really struggling right now with these conversations on earth minerals and how earth minerals have become central in geopolitics and policy making. And so that's a conversation we want to have. The third is on AI, ethics, and the role of philanthropy. Those that attended the APC in Cairo had a fantastic day where we had all conversations on AI and how AI can be adopted and utilized by philanthropy, but also the contradictions and some of the opportunities that AI brings along. So that's the third, conversation that we want to have. And then the fourth will be on young people, the youth in the continent. And then the fifth is on trade. I think you already had a conversation on trade in the last episode, and we want to also have that conversation on trade. I mean, if all African countries were to trade among and within themselves, it could really be a game changer. And we are thinking of this conversation within the backdrop of what's happening with tariffs and all of that, and realizing that Africa might actually have an opportunity to reorganize its own trading system and make the best out of the current moment. So those are some of the conversations we want to have. But we also have a program here at CAPSI called Adoye, which is Women in African Philanthropy. And we are working with a list of high and highly experienced individuals coming from the philanthropic movement, especially the feminist and philanthropy movement. And we are working with them to reshape the narratives on philanthropy and the role that women play in philanthropy. And we think that that program could also be part of the framing and part of the platform in which we could deploy the blueprint. So those are some of the kind of plans that we have put in place to work with Lucy, Jerry, and Tamsin in adopting the blueprint in the African context. And I must say that we also had a session, maybe Tamsin might speak about that. We had a session at the last APC, which of course was facilitated by Lucy and Jerry and Tamsin, and lots of inputs that came from the audience.
Yeah, that was a brilliant conversation. Just asking people at the conference, what do you want? What do you need? That part of it is not rocket science, although it doesn't happen very often. Tamsin, you look like you were going to say something.
Yeah, I'm trying to, in fairness, go to some of the early comments and Gottlieb, I don't know if you wanted to speak. You put a couple in, but starting with your question to Nyla, I don't know if I think you're still here. I can't see you. If you can put your camera on. Oh, there you go. Hi, nice to see you.
Hi, nice to see you all. No, I was basically listening in and just reflecting on some of the things that were being said. I think my main question I put actually and this is sort of, the levels of complicity of ourselves into everything. Because there's nobody's an angel, yeah? So we're all in institutions. We've all been part of this. My hair are gray. You see some gray hairs also on the screens. So we've been around. We've been in these systems. And this is a moment, and I try, to not get depressed in the morning. I try to get up with the thought, what if we configure this or envisage what's happening now as in, well, call it a cathartic moment, as something that is really deeply foundationally changing things. What would that then mean? How would we look? What would we do in action? And starting very close to home. And not get into I think it was Lucy who said at the beginning about the overwhelming nature of everything. I mean, that's also a way to paralyze everybody. I try to resist that fundamentally, just by saying, okay, what if this is a moment 100 years from now? My mom always said, if you're too depressed about something, ask how you would look at things 10, 20, 30 years down the line, look back at this moment. It helps a lot to think this way. So I thought a lot of very fundamental questions came up, and think maybe we should not let go of the fact that this is a refoundational time. And so the exercise is to get rid of all the things that are distracting from that realization. And so I'm very grateful to the speakers of today. We have not met in person, but I loved your wisdom. And so I put a few questions in the chat accordingly, but it's mainly listening and trying to relate it to practice. But I honestly feel this is probably the last chance we have to do something right, because it is nothing is new, but it's all to the surface now, and so I think we just need to be very, very focused.
Thanks.
Anyway.
Thank you, Gottlieb. if anybody has any questions, they want to put up their hand, but otherwise, just to say some that I did notice are Rose, Megan, Dana, and Catherine Fulton. So I don't know if any of you want to put up your hands and speak to your comment, or if there's anybody else.
I'm happy to speak about networks if that's sure. I'm Megan Haddock. I'm the executive director of the International Society for Third Sector Research, and I see some familiar faces on this call. And Becky, of course, is a member of our new network of research center directors. So we think that there are probably 150 research centers around the world, and we maintain a network now actively of about 60 directors of research centers. We've met in person a couple of times now, and we meet online once a month. And I think that research centers are a little bit different than just individual researchers inside universities or inside think tanks. I mean, they are the hubs of so much local knowledge and so much local connection. I think the expertise that people like Becky bring to the conversation can be so beneficial to share that knowledge with other research centers around the world. And that's a great way, I think, to elevate all of this knowledge and elevate the conversation. So I think that there's so much benefit from discussion and conversation like this, and finding ways to strengthen that infrastructure. As Dana said, I mean, Dana pointed out that like networks can be certainly inequitable themselves and have their faults. So we need to find ways to improve those all the time. But my personal mission is to try to elevate local conversations and local knowledge that way. So I'm seeing so much benefit just in a couple of meetings that we've had, and feel convinced that like networks are such critical pieces of the infrastructure to move the conversation forward and find. I don't know, I need to figure out a way to share that idea better, but I keep coming back to that.
Thanks, Megan. Catherine and Rose, you both made some interesting comments. Do either of you want to speak to them?
Yes, I'm happy to. This is Rose. Gosh, my camera is not. Okay, let me see. Okay, there we go.
No.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity and this really important conversation. So I lead an organization called EPIC Africa, and EPIC stands for Enhancing Philanthropic Impact in Africa, of course. And we are sort of at the intersection of data, tech, and storytelling about African civil society and philanthropy. And recently, actually December last year, we launched a report on individual giving to African civil society organizations, whose findings surprised many of us, including myself, to find that there's huge, significant giving by just ordinary Africans to local organizations. And our expectation was like, yeah, so mostly maybe they'll be giving to humanitarian sort of issues, education and health. And indeed, most of the giving is towards education and health. But significantly, also over 30% are giving to organizations that work on human rights, gender, advocacy, and those sorts of issues. And it was just a realization that for many of us that we kind of wear this sort of the global philanthropy lens, and we don't see what's right in front of us. So we don't even look for it because we assume it's not there. And how our giving has been characterized is sort of this horizontal, we give to family and, we give to my mosque or to my church, but we're not doing systemic change. Quite contrary, and there have been quite, some stunning examples recently, like, the protest in Kenya that funded. We saw a lot of generosity around, funding, victims, people who were beaten up or in hospital, people who died, needed to be buried, and all that sort of thing. So I think this is something that so for us, the need for data and more knowledge about what's actually happening, not what we think is happening, but what's actually happening, and building that data ecosystem is really, I think, really a piece of what needs to happen. We also just recently conducted a survey on the impact of the US government funding cuts on African civil society organizations. And yeah, it's devastating, but as someone prefaced earlier, actually most of the money that's designated for Africa never actually went to African organizations, but they're being affected very indirectly through services that then were being received through this. But what was also really interesting about the findings is that many respondents actually, and I'll post the report on the chat shortly, that they see this moment as a moment, a wake-up call, like a reset. It's like we knew it was coming. We didn't know how it would come. When it happened, of course, we were all like, oh my God, not so fast, right? Like, hold on, you should have given us a warning. But the signs were there, right from COVID times, particularly when people say the same things, we need to change, we need to, but then we went back to sort of the easy way. So, I like that word catharsis. Now here we are, right? Like we've been thrust into this, right? So what do we do? And that's, so I love the idea of a blueprint, and actually the core recommendation in the report was actually the need to develop, a blueprint for African civil society sustainability. What that looks like, we have no idea, but we think that it needs to involve, the stakeholders to figure out what that looks like, and how do we operate, how do we get funded, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, so I think that needs to be also could go into part of this conversation. So Becky, I look forward to, and Becky was very helpful in all of that. Thanks, Becky. He's a former colleague at Trust Africa and a good friend, as is Jerry, who I saw somewhere. Yeah, so I think this conversation need to converge. I think there's a momentum, and how do we bring it together so that it becomes a movement? I think is the moment is here. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, please share the links to your work. That's fantastic.
Catherine, did you want to speak to your comment?
Yeah, and I'm looking at what Sheila just posted. I do want to make the point that there are plenty of places all over the world that face exactly what Sheila is saying. In this country, there are millions of undocumented people who are living with a sense of crisis and immediate threat that is just overwhelming. And the basic human need issues, even in rich places, the wealth inequities exist within wealthy countries as well as across them, and within countries that are not wealthy. And I think this issue of how we deal with the immediate crisis in front of us, the immediate growing humanitarian crisis everywhere. And so I think it's not just a question of timeframes, it's a question at the altitude at which one conducts this conversation. The closer you get to the ground, and which many of the comments here have spoken to, the picture just looks really different, and the choices look different. And so I don't have a lot of answers, but I do think that we can't spend in places that do have some more discretion. We can't spend all of our energy and effort dealing with the immediate crisis, because we're not going to do anything except avoid some of the worst outcomes and create a few better ones. But it is also not okay to think that the choice is between fundamental structural long-term change and that we can only work on that. We can't. And so I'm interested in the comment about mutual aid. What I love about that is that were we to do it well now, we're both meeting the immediate need and seeding the ways of operating in a very different way in longer term. And I think finding more things like that and helping each other how to do that. And so I just I appreciate I'm learning a lot and reflecting a lot on things that I have not seen in my life with great humility. But that's it's a plea that we somehow when I was a young person, which was a long time ago, the language system was change, not charity. Instead of the language of justice and solidarity and these things, it was like, okay, how do we focus on change, not charity? Because charity, it leads to dependence and putting your finger in the wall, and it doesn't actually solve anything. I don't think we have that choice anymore. I don't see that. I don't like that language system anymore, but I think that's an immoral choice. I don't think we can turn our back on what's happening and in terms of immediate suffering. And I would love to hear what Sheila has to say about that. I don't know you, Sheila, but I loved your comment. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. Can I ask Nyla or Becky if they want to respond first and then go to Sheila? No? Sheila, are you there?
I'm here, but I can't turn my camera on, if that's okay.
That's okay.
What would you like me to say?
I think Catherine just invited you to speak to your comment and
what more can I say? What more can I say? It's crisis after crisis every single day. It's exhausting having to live through a genocide. I'm sorry. I don't think I can speak.
Thank you, Sheila. Yeah, understood. It's very, very painful times.
Yeah.
Lots of love for you. Come.
Sana and I had a conversation. We met for the first time about maybe 2 months ago, and it went very much like this. We were both in hysterics by the end of it. And we've never met in person, but we just couldn't stop crying.
Yeah.
So I get it. Yeah.
The pain is as deep as it gets for humans.
I mean, I think Shala is presenting a moment of real, like, Shala is not Palestinian. She's not Palestinian. And I think that partly for me is what is so kind of powerful about her reaction, and I think also to the comment that she was making, a lot of us in this space have really been almost losing our mind. Like we're almost losing our minds because we're having meetings. And that was one of the things when Shahla and I first had our Zoom call a couple of months ago. The first thing we said is like, I don't understand what we're doing. Like, what are we doing? What are we having this conversation about? And how is this conversation going to lead to anything when we're literally talking about, babies being blown apart? And you feel like you're losing your mind. And I think that's part of what her comment is that when she's saying, the global north needs to get it together and show up, I think what she's really, and I don't want to speak for her, but at least if I had to echo what she's saying, it's a question of, if we're not opening every single conversation, especially in this sector, to look at what are we doing to end this and never let it happen again, then I don't think we are of any use. as human beings.
Mm.
And so I don't think that it's meant to be aggressive. It's not meant to be rude, but it is absolutely meant to be confrontational, and as it should be.
Yes, not
You
at all.
know,
Not at all.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, both Nyla and Shala. It
I just meant we need you. We need you to, because you have that power, you have that luxury to be able to plan. And I know that, as Catherine mentioned, you also have communities around you that have that crisis going on. But I don't want to say that, I don't want to compare people's situations. But what is going on here is, it's, it's just a lot. It's a lot.
Yep. Yeah, it's leveraging the power of that privilege. I think that's what we're begging people to do. I think and it's begging, literally, it's begging. That's, it goes back to the alliance resignation. It goes back to, like, we can't just sit around and be like, I wish you would do this a bit better. No, like, I'm begging you, please, for one freaking moment, just be honest and allow us at least to name things what they are. I mean, until today, I don't think Alliance Magazine has explicitly, outside of allowing people like me and I think it was like 6 or 7 Palestinian organizations to use the word genocide. They refuse to use the word genocide. They refuse to say it's apartheid. They'll still call it a conflict. They allow us to say it and then think that that's enough. Well, we allowed you to say it. We need to stay neutral. I think that's what you're hearing in that kind of rage.
Yeah. And I'm very appreciative of the pain and the rage. I want to acknowledge it. There's nothing like losing everything, being attacked daily.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think it's for this conversation to particularly pick up on the fact that there are then, as well as people experiencing it directly and indirectly, there are some of us on the call with room to plan and the requirement to show up. And I would hope that everyone is looking at themselves individually. We talk about institutional philanthropy, but they're made up of people showing up in the ways that are necessary that will actually stop this madness. And it might be exactly what Jerry sort of set us out on metaphorically, this Senterej movement of it takes everything. It takes all of everything to start out. Oh, thank you for sharing that, Shala. We're getting toward the end of time for this conversation, although I'm sure there will be more that others will participate in. Why don't I just turn it back to Nyla and Becky to see if you have things to add to the conversation or to tie things up. I suppose that's my job, but I'm not very good at it. So, Becky, any last words?
Yeah, thanks so much for the conversation and the sobering moments, which I think in many ways are a call for us to be reimaginative in terms of how philanthropy ought to be deployed, but also in terms of how we center our own agencies as well. I think that for many who are going through different forms of conflicts and dispositions and underdevelopment, the real call is how do we reimagine philanthropy going forward and how do we center people's agency in order to fully liberate ourselves from the exigencies of the past. And so I think it's really a call for us to reimagine philanthropy, reimagine development, and reimagine the powers that we have as individuals in certain contexts and certain geographies. And I think this conversation is just a start, but more needs to happen in order for us to fully appreciate the times and the moment. So somebody said, don't let a crisis to waste. And I think that's what we should be doing. Thanks.
Thank you, Becky, for reminding us of our own individual responsibility. Isla?
I mean, I think I've said pretty much, I mean, everything that I would like to say. I don't want to belabor, but one thing I think I would, and I'd echo everything that Becky's saying and everything that Shahla has said and everything that everyone has kind of, contributed to this. But I think one of the things, um, I feel like, and I'm so glad that the conversation took this turn because we started out this conversation saying we want to be honest and open and call things what they are. And so I'm so grateful for Shahla to have been so open and vulnerable and clear about what she's feeling, and then allowing us kind of this moment to reflect on that, because as awkward as it is, that is the reality. Um, I, you know, I there's so many things that we can rage against. There's so many things that we can ask for. There's so many demands that we can make about all this. But one of the things that I will just point out, in addition to everything else that we've said, something we didn't touch on in this moment is about the power of that crowdfunding. It was something we talked about, Lucy, earlier, but about, how, and I really have been saying, and I think, a lot of people think maybe I'm exaggerating, but I really, really, really believe the way fundraising for Gaza has happened is going to literally change the way this sector works. And I think if people aren't willing to see that and confront it and leverage it, I mean, I hate to use that word because it sounds so exploitative, but if they're not willing to, they are going to be left behind. So the context I'm referring to is sometime after maybe 7 or 8 months of this genocide, the borders in Rafah between Gaza and Egypt were opened, and there was this kind of exodus of Gazans leaving Gaza to come to Egypt. I think it's important for people to realize that the Egyptian government has never officially accepted and acknowledged that they have taken in any displaced persons, but they have, and over the last 2 years, it's probably somewhere close to, at one point we had said it's 120,000 people, but that was a year ago already. So it's probably somewhere close to 300,000 people. It's also important to recognize the context that these people are illegal. They came in on tourist visas. The tourist visas are valid only for 30 days. They are not leaving. There's nowhere to go. So they are not eligible because they don't come in as refugees. They're not eligible for any refugee benefits. So UNRWA is useless to them. UNHCR is useless to them because they're not registered as refugees. So there's 300,000 people approximately who have come into Egypt, an economy that is already suffering and struggling, and they are a burden on that economy. We can't offer them jobs. We can't give them, and they have to live somewhere. Residents, poor or rich, deserve to live in adequate housing. They deserve to have dignity. And so it's literally people like us, all of us, our friends, our families, our networks have funded the last 2 years of these people's lives. And just as a point of one data point to consider is that the average cost of those visas, which is normally $650, was $7,000 per person. Average was $7,000. It started at 5, it ended at 15. So the average was about $7,500. So multiply that by 300,000 people. And the Egyptian government, as much as it hasn't acknowledged that this was happening, has taken that money in concert with the person that was arranging these tours. It's a tourism company. And how did that money make it when big philanthropy has entirely ignored this crisis, entirely ignored this Holocaust? It came from just normal people. GoFundMe, and then GoFundMe shut down a ton of these. So we ended up having to go through LaunchGood. We ended up having to go through, Sadaqa.org. Every single possible, I literally gave cash to people who I knew were going to be able to smuggle it across Rafah borders. Just $10,000 in cash. So that, if people don't recognize that and then think that they can, I'm going to have a meeting with Ford Foundation and see if they'll give me a grant, that's going to change. And it needs to.
Yeah. I could not agree with you more. It's both such a profound example of humanity at work in inhumane times, and I think we are going to stop talking about philanthropy as just the big foundations.
Yeah.
While we should continue to talk about them when we want to talk about how to change them and how to
Mhm.
change this system. But I think as a general educational process, people are becoming much more aware of all these individual opportunities, driven, no doubt, by their own horror and pain at what's happening.
Mhm.
And so it's
Mhm.
people that build institutions too, and we can build, as you said so wonderfully, Nyla. I probably going to quote you forever on this about, you know that we can build alternatives, don't you? There's literally no rule that says we can't.
I stand by
Um,
that.
on that note, thank you all for this conversation. Tamsin has put a lot of information in the chat about where you can get the notes. The conversations continue. I'm so very proud and grateful to have the opportunity to be working with Becky on, hopefully others from this call on African blueprints, whatever they might become, and if there are others in other regions that are thinking of doing something like this, very honored to talk with you as well. Thank you all, and
Thank you so much.
for everything that each of you does.